She was 7 years old, barefoot, and shaking so hard her teeth clattered like loose fence boards in a January wind. And the man standing over her wasn't trying to help her. He was trying to make sure no one else did. Dale Pruitt grabbed the child by the wrist and dragged her toward his wagon like she was a sack of feed he'd dropped on the road. "You don't belong to nobody out here," he snarled, not caring who heard, "and nobody's coming for you." That was the moment Gideon Cross made a decision that would unravel the rest of his life and rebuild it into something he never thought he deserved. If you were standing on that trail and saw what he saw, what would you have done? If this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The trail north of the Mercer Ranch had no name on any map Gideon Cross had ever seen, and he'd seen more maps than most men his age had any reason to. It cut through a narrow draw between two limestone ridges, wound past a half-frozen creek that flooded every spring and dried to cracked mud by August, and eventually disappeared into the tree line like it had given up trying to go anywhere worth going. Most riders avoided it. The footing was bad, the shadows came early, and there was something about the silence up there that made horses uneasy, and men talked too much just to fill it. Gideon didn't talk much. That was one of the first things Silas Mercer had noticed when he hired him 6 weeks ago, and one of the things that made the old rancher trust him slightly less than he trusted most strangers, which was not very much at all. He'd come down from the north with a bedroll, a horse named Caleb, and a reference letter from a rancher in Wyoming that Silas had actually sent a wire to verify. The rancher confirmed everything. Good worker, honest, keeps to himself. Silas had folded the letter, slipped it into his breast pocket, and told Gideon he could start Monday. He hadn't said welcome. Gideon hadn't expected him to. He was 34 years old and had been working other men's land since he was 17. He knew how to read a spread, which fences needed mending before the owner noticed, which water lines were about to give, which horses had been ridden too hard too recently and needed a lighter hand. He knew how to disappear into the rhythm of a place so completely that within 2 weeks most people forgot they hadn't always known him. It wasn't a skill he developed on purpose. It was just what happened when a man spent long enough being nobody's permanent fixture. He had no family left. That wasn't self-pity, it was geography. His mother had died when he was 11. His father had lasted 3 more years before the bottle finished the job that grief had started. He had a sister somewhere in Colorado who had married a school teacher and sent him a Christmas card once, 8 years ago, with a return address he'd never written back to. He'd meant to. He still meant to. The card was still in his saddlebag, creased soft as old skin from being handled and put away so many times. He thought about that card sometimes when he was out on a long stretch of trail alone, which is exactly where he was on the afternoon everything changed. He'd ridden north to check the upper fence line after Silas mentioned 3 posts had been found knocked down near the ridge draw. Cattle country problems. Nothing dramatic. He'd taken a pouch of staples, a fencing tool, and a half-eaten biscuit wrapped in cloth, and he'd spent the better part of the morning fixing what needed fixing and not thinking about much else. It was on his way back, just past the creek crossing, that he heard it. Not a sound he could identify immediately, more like the wrong kind of silence, the kind that has something held inside it. Caleb felt it too. The horse's ears went forward and his stride shortened, and Gideon let him slow without pushing him, because he had learned a long time ago that a horse's instincts were usually right, and his own overconfidence had gotten him into more trouble than he cared to admit. He came around the bend in the trail and saw the wagon first, a battered, dark-sided freight wagon with a missing rear board, parked at an angle that suggested the driver had stopped in a hurry or without much care for where exactly the wheels landed. One of the horses in the traces was pawing the ground with slow, irritated patience. Then he saw the man. Dale Pruitt, though Gideon didn't know his name yet, was thick through the shoulders and red in the face, with the kind of hands that looked like they'd been used as tools more than as anything gentle. He was standing in the middle of the trail with his back to Gideon, and he was leaning over something. Gideon pulled Caleb up and looked harder. The something was a child. She was pressed against the base of a scrub oak at the edge of the trail, arms wrapped around her own knees, her whole body wound tight as a fist. Her feet were bare. Her dress was wrong for the weather. Thin cotton, not nearly enough for a Montana afternoon in late September, even in the valley. Her face was tipped up toward Pruitt's, and what was on it wasn't defiance. It was the specific, terrible stillness of a child who has already learned that reacting makes things worse. "I said get up," Pruitt said, and his voice was not the voice of a man who was concerned about her. It was the voice of a man managing an inconvenience. "You don't belong to nobody out here, and nobody's coming for you, so you're coming with me." He reached down and grabbed her wrist. The child made no sound. That was the part that hit Gideon like something physical. Not the grabbing, not the roughness, but the silence of a little girl who had apparently learned that screaming did not help. Gideon was off Caleb before he'd consciously decided to get off. His boots hit the ground and he was already moving, and his voice came out level, which surprised even him. "Let go of her arm." Pruitt straightened and turned around. He looked at Gideon the way men like him always looked at interference, with a particular kind of contempt that is partly anger and partly the assumption that it won't last. "Mind your business, Drifter." "I am," Gideon said. "Let go of her arm." There was a pause, the kind where a man decides which version of himself he wants to be in the next 30 seconds. Pruitt looked at Gideon, then at the child, then back at Gideon. Something in what he saw, or didn't see, because Gideon's face was very still, seemed to recalculate his odds. He released the girl's wrist, slowly, with the deliberate slowness of a man making clear it was his choice. "She ain't yours," he said. "She ain't yours either," Gideon said. "Walk away from her." Another pause. Then Pruitt made a sound through his nose that might have been contempt or might have been acceptance, and he turned and climbed back up onto the wagon seat. He didn't say anything else. He clicked his tongue at the horses and the wagon rolled forward, and he didn't look back. And Gideon stood in the trail watching until the wagon was around the next bend, and the sound of the wheels faded to nothing. He turned to the girl. She still hadn't moved from the base of the tree. Her wrist had a red mark on it where Pruitt's hand had been. She was staring at Gideon with eyes that were dark and very large and completely unreadable, the way children's eyes get when they're past the crying stage and have moved into something quieter and more worrying. Gideon crouched down to her level. He didn't reach for her. He just got small, the way you do with animals that have been frightened, and he waited. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly. "You lost?" A pause, then a tiny nod. "What's your name?" She looked at him for a long moment, doing whatever calculation a 7-year-old does when deciding whether a stranger is safe. Then, "Clara." "Clara," he repeated. "Okay, I'm Gideon. I'm not going to make you do anything. But if you want, I can take you somewhere warm, and we can figure out where you belong. How's that sound?" She looked at Caleb, who had wandered a few feet off the trail and was investigating a clump of dry grass with great professional interest. "Is that your horse?" "That's Caleb." "Does he bite?" "Not people," Gideon said. "Just his feed bucket when it's empty." Something shifted in the girl's face. Not quite a smile, but the memory of one. She let him help her up. He took off his jacket, a worn canvas thing, nothing special, and draped it around her shoulders without asking, because she was shivering and asking would have taken time they didn't have. She was light. He noticed that. Too light for her size, in the way that told him she hadn't been eating as regularly as she should have been. He lifted her onto Caleb, then mounted behind her, making sure she had something solid to hold on to. She gripped the saddle horn with both hands and sat straight, and he noticed she rode without leaning back into him, which meant she was either used to horses or too proud to show she was scared. Either one was fine with him. They rode back down the trail toward the Mercer Ranch. "How'd you end up out here by yourself?" he asked, after they'd been riding a few minutes. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "I was following the creek. Mama says don't, but I saw a fox." "Foxes will get you every time," he said, without judgment. "I didn't catch it." "No," he agreed. "You don't catch foxes. They catch you." She seemed to think about this. "My mama's going to be so mad at me." "She's probably more scared than mad right now." Another pause. "Do you think she's looking?" "I think she never stopped looking," he said. He felt her relax, very slightly, against the arm he had across the front of the saddle. Not leaning, just releasing some of the tension she'd been holding in her small spine since he'd found her. They came down out of the draw and into the lower pasture, and Gideon could see the Mercer house ahead, smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, afternoon light going gold and thin across the grass. He could also see Ruth Mercer standing on the porch, shading her eyes with one hand, watching them come in. She must have seen them from a distance because she was already starting down the porch steps before they were close enough to speak. Ruth Mercer was 61 years old and had been running a cattle ranch longer than most of the men who worked it had been alive. She was not a woman who showed surprise easily, but when she got close enough to see what Gideon was carrying in the saddle with him, something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to hide. "Lord have mercy," she said quietly. Then, to the girl, "Honey, where did you come from?" "The creek," Clara said, with the directness of the very young. "I was following a fox." "Of course you were," Ruth said, in a tone that held more warmth than censure. She looked up at Gideon. "You find her up on the North Trail?" "Just past the crossing," he said. "There was a man with her, a freight wagon. Big fellow, red face, didn't want to let her go." Ruth's expression sharpened. "Pruitt? Didn't get his name. Dark wagon, missing a board off the back? That's him." Ruth's jaw tightened in a way that told Gideon this was not new information about the man, and none of it was good. She reached up and lifted Clara down from the saddle with the competence of a woman who had raised children and held livestock, and was not intimidated by either. The girl went without protest. Ruth wrapped her arms around her in a way that was both practical and genuinely warm, and Clara, who had held herself rigid and controlled since the moment Gideon found her, finally made a small sound and buried her face in Ruth's shoulder. "Come inside," Ruth said to the child. "We'll get you warm and get something in you, and then we'll figure out where your mama is." She started toward the house, then stopped and looked back at Gideon, who had dismounted and was checking Caleb's left foreleg with the automatic attention of a man who knew horses came before pride. "Gideon." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, once, and went back to Caleb. Ruth watched him for a moment. The methodical, unhurried way. He ran his hand down the horse's leg, the absence of any performance about what he'd just done, the way he seemed to have already filed it away as done and moved on to the next necessary thing. Then she turned and went inside. Silas was at the kitchen table when she came in with the girl. He looked up from the ledger he'd been working on. Silas Mercer was not a man who could sit still without a task, and registered the child with the composed patience of a man who had learned that his wife's life regularly contained developments he hadn't been informed about in advance. "Who's this?" "Clara," Ruth said. "She was following a fox." Silas absorbed this. "Where'd she come from?" "Up on the North Trail. Gideon brought her in." A pause. "Gideon?" "Yes." Silas set down his pencil. He looked at Clara, who was sitting at the table now, with a wool blanket around her shoulders that Ruth had produced from somewhere, drinking hot broth from a cup she held in both hands. Then he looked at Ruth. "Pruitt had her," Ruth said quietly. Silas's expression did something complicated and compressed. He was not a man who swore in the house, so he didn't. But Ruth could read him well enough to know what he wasn't saying, and she agreed with every word of it. "Where's the girl's mother?" he said. "We're about to find out," Ruth said. "I'm going to ask around at the Harmons' place first. They know most everybody who's come through the valley this season." The door opened and Gideon appeared in the frame. He'd taken care of Caleb and washed his hands at the pump outside, and he was holding his hat in his hands with the automatic courtesy of a man raised by someone who minded manners. "Sorry to interrupt. I thought you'd want to know. The girl said her mother lives at the Halcott homestead, the one with the blue door, east of the Miller property." Ruth turned. "You know that place?" "I rode past it last week checking the east fence. Saw a woman and a child outside. Small place, well kept. Flower boxes on the windows." Ruth looked at Silas. Silas looked at Gideon. "How do you know it's the same woman?" Silas asked. Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. "You said your mama had flower boxes," he said. "On the windows." Clara nodded. "She plants them every year, even though Daddy—" She stopped, looked at the table. "Even though I told her they froze every winter anyway." The kitchen went quiet in the particular way kitchens go quiet when a child says something that reveals more than they meant to. "Daddy's gone," Clara said simply, to the table. "He died 2 winters ago." Ruth pressed her lips together. Silas looked down at his ledger without seeing it. Gideon said quietly, "I'm sorry." Clara looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes. "Did you know him?" No, Gideon said, but he sounds like someone worth missing. It was such a strange, plain thing to say that it caught Clara completely off guard. For just a moment, the careful composure she'd been maintaining cracked, and her chin wobbled, and then she swallowed hard and pulled herself back together with the visible effort of a child who has already learned that grief is something you manage in private. He was, she said. Ruth cleared her throat. I'll ride over to the Halcott place and let the mother know her daughter's safe. She looked at Silas. You can stay here with Clara. Silas opened his mouth, looked at the child, closed his mouth. Fine. Ruth was already moving toward the door when she passed Gideon, still standing in the frame. She paused. Sit down, she said to him, quietly enough that only he could hear. Have something warm. You look like you've had a day. He started to shake his head. That wasn't a question, she said. He sat down. Silas looked at him across the table. Gideon looked back. Clara looked at both of them with the frank, evaluating gaze of a child watching two adults figure out their arrangement. You play checkers? Silas asked finally. Passably, Gideon said. Silas got up and took the checkerboard down from the shelf above the stove. They were 3 moves in when they heard the sound outside. Hoofbeats, fast, not the measured trot of Ruth on an errand, but the uncontrolled gallop of someone who had been riding that way for a while. Gideon was on his feet before the sound registered consciously, and Clara was already at the window, and then the door burst open. The woman in the doorway was breathing hard, her hair half out of its pins, her coat buttoned wrong, one button off, so the left side hung lower than the right, and her face had the particular expression of a parent who has been imagining disasters for 3 hours and is not yet able to believe they haven't come true. She saw Clara. Clara saw her. Mama. The woman crossed the room in 3 steps and had her daughter in her arms before the word was finished, and she held on with both arms, tight and wordless, her face pressed into Clara's hair. Clara held back just as hard, her arms around her mother's neck, her feet off the ground. Nobody said anything. Gideon stood by the checkerboard and watched. He was very still. The woman, Naomi Hart, though he didn't know her name yet, finally surfaced from her daughter's hair and looked up, and her eyes found Gideon the way eyes do when they've been told to look for someone. Ruth must have met her on the road, he realized. Must have told her. She looked at him for a long moment. He had been looked at with gratitude before, in a general way, the way you look at anyone who's done you a service. This was different. This was the way a person looks at you when you've handled something irreplaceable and given it back undamaged, and they need to know the nature of the person who held it. He didn't look away. He also didn't perform anything. He just stood there and let her look. You found her, Naomi said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. Yes, ma'am. And the man, Ruth said there was a man. He's gone, Gideon said. He won't come back. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact, not making a promise. Naomi seemed to hear the difference. Thank you, she said. It was the same thing Ruth had said, an hour ago. 2 words. But they landed differently this time, and Gideon couldn't have explained exactly why, and he wasn't sure he was supposed to understand it yet. She's a brave kid, he said. Didn't make a sound when I found her. Held it together the whole ride back. Naomi looked down at Clara, then back at Gideon, and something in her face shifted, not into softness exactly, but into a kind of recognition, like a door opening by a single inch. She gets that from her father, she said. Yes, Gideon said. I got that impression. Ruth came in behind Naomi, slightly out of breath, and took in the scene with the satisfied calm of a woman who had managed to arrange the right people in the right room without appearing to arrange anything at all. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. Something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged. Silas, standing near the stove, was watching the drifter with an expression that had shifted slightly from its default position of contained suspicion, just slightly. Just enough that Ruth would notice it later and file it away without comment. Clara, still in her mother's arms, looked over Naomi's shoulder at Gideon. He says foxes don't get caught, she announced. He says they catch you. Naomi blinked, looked at Gideon. Does he? It's true, Clara insisted. I believe you, Naomi said, still looking at him, with something in her eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile, or might have been something she wasn't ready to name yet. Gideon picked up his hat. I should get back to work, he said. He went out the door and back to the barn. and he didn't look back. And the autumn afternoon settled around the Mercer Ranch like it always did, slow and golden and indifferent to everything that had just changed inside it. But something had changed. Even the man walking away from the house could feel it in the air behind him, the way you feel a fire's warmth after you've already stepped back from it. He stopped at the barn door for a moment, for no reason he could name. Then he went inside and got back to work. The days after Clara's rescue settled back into the ordinary rhythm of ranch life, the way water settles after you've thrown a stone into it. The surface smooths over, but something underneath has shifted, and anyone paying attention can feel it. Gideon paid attention. That was his particular habit, and it had never served him especially well in terms of his own peace of mind. He noticed, for instance, that Ruth Mercer had quietly begun assigning him fence work on the east side of the property with a frequency that had nothing to do with how much fence actually needed mending over there. He noticed that the east side of the property happened to share a boundary line that ran within half a mile of the Halcott homestead. He noticed this and said nothing, because saying something would have required acknowledging that he'd noticed, and acknowledging that he'd noticed would have required explaining why he'd been paying close enough attention to notice, and that was a door he wasn't ready to open. He did the fence work. He did it well. He did not ride past the Halcott homestead. He did not ride past it on Monday or Wednesday or the following Friday. He was very deliberate about this. He took the long way around, back through the south draw, which added 20 minutes to the ride and accomplished nothing except the preservation of a boundary he'd set for himself without quite being able to articulate the reason. Ruth noticed. Of course she did. She noticed the way she noticed everything on the ranch. Without comment, without expression, with the quiet accumulation of a woman who had been watching human nature for 6 decades and had long since stopped being surprised by it. "You're going the long way," she said one morning, not looking up from the bread she was working. Gideon was at the door, pulling on his gloves. "Road's drier." Said Ruth. That was all she said. But the sound she made contained an entire editorial opinion, and they both knew it. He went out. He took the long way. He fixed 3 posts that didn't need fixing and 1 that did, and he ate his lunch sitting on the top rail of the fence, looking south toward nothing in particular. And when he rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, he felt approximately as settled as a man who has been arguing with himself in a language he doesn't fully speak. The complication arrived on a Thursday, in the form of Clara Hart, who appeared at the ranch's east gate at 2:30 with a basket covered in a cloth and an expression of immense personal dignity that suggested she was on official business. Gideon was closest. He was always closest to the east gate these days, which he refused to examine. "Hello?" Clara said. "Hello," he said. "My mama made apple preserves," she announced, holding out the basket. "She said to bring them to Mrs. Mercer, for helping us." That was kind of her. "She made 2 jars, but 1 is for you." Clara held his gaze with the directness that was apparently just her natural mode of being in the world. "She said that specifically. 1 for Mrs. Mercer and 1 for the man who found me. That's you." Gideon looked at the basket. "Your mama didn't have to do that." "I know," Clara said. "She wanted to." A pause. "She was up late making them. She doesn't usually cook at night. She said she needed something to do with her hands." He took the basket. "You want to come in?" he said. "Mrs. Mercer's in the kitchen. She'd like to see you." Clara considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating a business proposal. "For a little while," she decided. "Mama doesn't know I stopped here. She thinks I went straight back." "Then maybe we shouldn't keep you too long." "Probably not," Clara agreed and walked past him through the gate with complete self-possession. Ruth's reaction when Clara appeared in her kitchen was the closest thing to uncomplicated joy that Gideon had seen on the older woman's face since he'd arrived at the ranch. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word and gathered the girl in briefly, then held her at arm's length and looked at her with the assessment of a woman checking for damage. "You're all right," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," Clara said. "Mama worries more than I do." "That's what mamas do," Ruth said. "It's in the job description." She took the basket, looked inside, and her face did something warm. "Apple preserves. That woman." She set the basket on the counter and looked at Gideon. "You get yours?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She turned back to Clara. "You hungry? I've got biscuits from this morning." "I'm not supposed to eat between meals," Clara said, and then looked at the biscuits, and then looked back at Ruth. "This counts as a meal." Ruth said serenely. Sit down. Clara sat down. Gideon, who had come in to deliver the basket and intended to go back out, found himself sitting down too, without entirely remembering deciding to. Ruth put biscuits in front of both of them and poured coffee for herself and Gideon and milk for Clara, and sat down at the end of the table, and it felt, uncomfortably, precisely, like something that had been doing this for years. Your mama's doing all right? Ruth asked Clara. She's okay, Clara said, with the careful qualification of a child who has learned that okay and good are not always the same thing. She works a lot. She fixes things herself mostly. She fixed the roof last month. By herself? She got up on it with a ladder. I had to hold the ladder. Clara seemed to consider whether this constituted bragging. She's not scared of much. No, Ruth said. I imagine she isn't. Gideon was quiet. He was looking at his biscuit. Mr. Gideon doesn't talk much, Clara observed to Ruth, in the way children state obvious things that adults have decided not to. No, Ruth agreed. He doesn't. My daddy didn't either, Clara said. Mama says quiet men are thinking, loud men are performing. Ruth laughed, a real one, short and genuine. She looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at his biscuit with great dedication. Your mama's a smart woman, Ruth said. She reads a lot, Clara said. She has boxes of books. We couldn't bring all of them when we moved, so she picked her favorites and left the rest. She cried about it. She thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. A pause. I didn't tell her I saw. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That was kind of you, Ruth said. Clara shrugged one shoulder. She does a lot. She doesn't need to feel bad about books, too. Gideon finished his biscuit and stood up. I should get back out, he said. Clara, tell your mama thank you for the preserves. You could tell her yourself, Clara said. She's home all afternoon. The sentence landed with the precision of an accidentally thrown stone. Clara had the self-aware innocence of a child who says exactly what she means without knowing yet that adults spend a great deal of energy saying something different. Maybe I will, he said, which was the nearest to an honest answer he could manage. He went back out to the fence line and worked until the light started going, and he did not ride past the Halcott homestead, and the jar of apple preserves sat on the small shelf above his bunk, in the bunkhouse that night, and he looked at it for a while before he blew out the lamp. It was good. That was the irritating part. He opened it 3 days later, tried a spoonful on a piece of bread, and it was genuinely, specifically, infuriatingly good. The kind of preserves that take patience and attention and a good eye for when things are exactly right, no more and no less than they should be. He ate the whole jar over the following week and felt irrationally annoyed about it. Silas noticed the jar on the shelf. Silas noticed it the same way Ruth noticed the long way around, without comment, without expression. But he noticed it, and that night at supper he mentioned, without looking at Gideon, that the Halcott fence had been showing some give on the south corner, and someone ought to check it before the weather turned. Gideon looked at him. Silas looked at his plate. I'll get to it, Gideon said. See that you do, Silas said. Ruth, across the table, said nothing. But her mouth did a thing that was not quite a smile and was not quite not one either. This was how it worked for a while. The ranch's entirely legitimate maintenance needs kept conspiring to send Gideon in the general direction of the Halcott homestead without ever quite sending him there directly. He remained extremely professional about this. He fixed the south corner of the Halcott fence, which did in fact need attention. He restaked a line of posts that ran along the creek bed where spring flooding had heaved them sideways. He did all of this work competently and efficiently, and he rode back to the Mercer Ranch each time without stopping at the Blue Door. He rode past it twice. He did not stop. He told himself this was because he hadn't been specifically invited, and he wasn't the kind of man who inserted himself where he wasn't needed. He told himself this with varying degrees of conviction. The first real conversation happened because of the water pump. It was a Tuesday in early October, and Gideon was coming back from the eastern boundary after a long morning, and he heard the sound of metal on metal, the specific frustrated percussion of someone hitting something that won't cooperate. He came around the stand of aspens along the creek and saw Naomi Hart standing beside the pump at the side of her property, a wrench in one hand and an expression on her face that suggested the pump had been uncooperative for longer than her patience comfortably accommodated. She heard Caleb's hoofbeats and looked up, And when she saw who it was, something moved across her face that he couldn't read. Not displeasure, not exactly surprise, but the specific recalibration of someone who had been thinking about a problem alone and has just realized they don't have to. He stopped. He didn't get off the horse immediately. He waited for an invitation, which was the thing he did when he wasn't certain of his welcome. "It won't prime," she said. "I've packed the leather twice and it still won't hold a seal." He got down. He crouched beside the pump and looked at it the way he looked at everything that needed fixing. Without rushing, without performing expertise he didn't have, just looking. The pump was old. Not poorly made, just honestly worn, the way things get when they've been used hard and maintained with care, but eventually time makes its argument regardless of maintenance. "You got a spare leather cup?" "In the barn, 2 of them." "Let's try the other one. Sometimes the second fits better." She went to the barn and came back with a small tin box, and he replaced the cup with the slow patience of a man who doesn't mind taking time to do something right. And she stood nearby and watched, and neither of them said anything for a few minutes, which was its own kind of conversation. "Clara said she came by the ranch last week," Naomi said. "She did. Brought preserves from you." He worked the pump handle experimentally. It caught, stuttered, caught again. Water came. "Those were good, by the way." "She wasn't supposed to stop there. She was supposed to come straight home." "She mentioned that." Naomi was quiet, then, "She likes you." He pumped the handle a few more times, making sure it held. It held. "She's a good kid." She had nightmares for a week after. Naomi stopped. "After the trail. She didn't tell me about the man. Ruth told me." Gideon straightened up and looked at her for the first time since he'd crouched down. She was looking directly at him, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy and is deciding whether to set it down. "I'm glad you were there," she said. "I've been trying to find a way to say that properly since it happened, and I don't think there is one." "You said it fine," he said. "I mean it more than that." She looked at the pump, then at him. "Clara told me what you said to her, about her father, that he sounded like someone worth missing." He didn't respond to that. "It was the right thing to say," she said quietly. "It's hard to know the right thing to say. Most people don't." He nodded, once. "She told me about the books you left behind," he said, "when you moved." Naomi looked up sharply. "She didn't mean to tell anything out of school," he said quickly. "It came up sideways. She was talking about you the way kids do when they're proud of someone." The sharpness softened. "She talks too much." "She talks about the right things," he said. "There's a difference." Naomi looked at him for a moment. The October light was coming through the aspens at a low angle, making everything look like something worth keeping. She brushed her hair back from her face. It had come loose at some point during the pump battle, and said, "I have coffee on, if you want." He looked at the pump, which was working. He looked at Caleb, who was tied to the fence post and entirely unconcerned. He looked at Naomi, who was waiting without pressure, without performance, just a woman asking a simple question and prepared to accept either answer. "Yeah," he said. "All right." The inside of the Halcott homestead was small and organized in the particular way of someone who has less space than they need and has made careful decisions about every inch of it. Books on a shelf that had been made from barn boards. Not elegant, but solid. A rag rug in front of the stove. A child's drawings tacked to one wall with the kind of deliberate display that communicates that they are art, not decoration. Clara's, obviously. They were of horses mostly, and one that appeared to be a fox. Naomi poured coffee without asking how he took it, which was black and which was correct. Either she'd guessed or she'd been told. "How long have you been at the Mercer Ranch?" she asked. 7 weeks. Before that? Wyoming, 2 years at the Harlan spread outside Laramie. And before that? He looked at her. "You want the whole list?" "Only if it's interesting," she said without irony. He thought about it. "Not particularly," he said. "Wyoming, before that New Mexico, before that a spell in Colorado. I move around." "Why?" The question was direct enough that it could have been rude, but her tone made it something else. Genuine, not prying, just the particular honesty of someone who'd had enough of the other kind. "Because staying was harder than moving," he said, "for a long time." She wrapped her hands around her own cup and looked at him. "What changed?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without saying more than he meant. "Nothing yet," he said, "but the math is starting to shift." She understood that. He could tell she understood it because she didn't push it further, just nodded slightly and looked at her coffee, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It had weight to it, the good kind of weight, like a blanket. Clara's teacher told me she wrote about you in her composition, Naomi said, the one about people who helped them. What did she write? She wrote that you talked to her like she was a regular person and not a child having a problem. Naomi's voice was careful and even. She said most adults talk down when they're trying to help. She said you didn't. Gideon was quiet. She's perceptive, he said finally. She's her father's daughter, Naomi said. He saw people clearly. It was one of his better qualities and his most exhausting one. Did he grow up around here? No, Pennsylvania. He came west for land and stayed for other reasons. She smiled at something she was seeing in a place he couldn't look. He always said Montana didn't ask you for your history. It only wanted to know what you were going to do next. Gideon held his cup and thought about that. That's about right, he said. He would have liked you, Naomi said. Then she looked surprised at herself, as if she hadn't planned to say it. I don't say that easily. I'll take it as given, he said. She laughed, a real one, short and unguarded, the kind that happens before you can manage it. Then she looked slightly embarrassed, which was the most ordinary human thing he'd seen in a long time, and he found that he was smiling at the table, which was something he hadn't done in longer than he could easily account for. He left 20 minutes later before the afternoon got away from him. Clara had not appeared during the visit, which meant she was either at school or exercising the kind of self-restraint that he was beginning to realize was another thing she'd gotten from a father she missed. He rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon gold of early October, and when he passed Silas at the gate, the old man looked at the clock on the barn wall, looked at Gideon, looked back at the clock. Fence took longer than expected, Silas said. Pump needed work too, Gideon said, at the Halcott place. Silas looked at him with the precise expression of a man who is deciding whether to say something or to say nothing, and has decided on nothing but wants the other person to know it was a decision. You eat? He said. Not yet. Ruth kept a plate. Gideon unsaddled Caleb and put him up and went inside and ate the plate Ruth had left, which was the kind of gesture that wasn't about supper. He knew that, and Ruth knew he knew it, and neither of them said a word about it, which was the fluent language of people who understand each other without needing to make it formal. What he didn't know was that Silas had gone out to the fence line that afternoon and personally walked the section Gideon had supposedly spent the morning on. The posts were straight, the wire was tight, the staples were set clean. Every yard of it was right. Silas walked it in the cooling afternoon with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes moving over the work. And when he was done, he stood there for a moment looking east toward the aspens and the creek and the Halcott homestead beyond. He did not like the situation. He had not liked it from the beginning. He had lost friends to drifters who turned out to be something other than what they appeared. He had watched the Mercer Valley go through 3 bad winters and 2 land disputes and 1 very ugly season involving a man who seemed decent right up until he wasn't, and that man had hurt people Silas cared about, and Silas carried that the way he carried most things, internally and permanently. Naomi Hart was not his daughter. He needed to be clear with himself about that. She was his neighbor, a woman who'd been widowed young and was working land alone with a child and doing it with more competence and less complaint than most men he'd known. Her husband had been a good man, quiet, reliable, the kind of man who was so unspectacular in his goodness that you didn't notice how much you depended on him until he was gone. Silas had gone to the funeral. He'd helped Naomi with her winter supplies that first December, when the grief was still raw and visible, and she couldn't quite get ahead of it. He'd done it because it was right, and because the valley took care of its own. That protective feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it had calcified over 2 years into something harder and more watchful. He looked at the fence. He looked east. The work was good. He had to admit that. It was genuinely good. He turned around and went back to the house and said nothing to anyone about where he'd been, and he sat down at the kitchen table with his ledger and didn't write anything in it for a while. Gideon spent the next 2 weeks working the worst job Silas could find for him without it looking deliberate. The old rancher had a gift for this. The water line at the north tank, which had been leaking since August and required lying on cold ground in a narrow trench to access. The shed roof, which needed resheeting in weather that kept threatening rain without committing to it. a section of the upper pasture that needed to be cleared of a deadfall that had come down in a wind event. 3 large aspens tangled together, requiring the kind of physical labor that leaves a man genuinely sore for days. Gideon did all of it. He did it without complaint and without commentary, and without the particular resentment that a man who suspects he's being tested sometimes projects onto the work itself. He just did it, the same way he did everything, methodically, patiently, with the care of someone who believes the job itself deserves doing right regardless of who's watching. He didn't see Naomi again for 11 days. Not for lack of reason. The fence line still needed attention here and there, and the pump probably needed a follow-up check before deep cold set in. But he held himself back from it, not from disinterest but from a kind of instinct about pacing that he had developed over years of watching things move too fast and fall apart for it. The letters he was writing were not love letters. He wasn't writing love letters. I was writing, at the bottom of his journal in the bunkhouse at night, the kinds of sentences a man writes when he's trying to understand what he thinks about something by putting it into words. He had been doing this since he was 19 and had never shown the journal to anyone and didn't plan to. It wasn't for showing, it was for the ordering of things. He wrote, "She left books behind. She knows what things cost." He wrote, "The girl doesn't have anyone to hold the ladder." He wrote, "Silas is watching me. I would be too." Then he closed the journal and blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the wind move across the Montana Valley with its old, indifferent voice that didn't care one way or another what any of them decided to do, and he found that indifference, strange as it was, quietly clarifying. Ruth found him in the barn the following Sunday morning, working on a piece of tack that needed stitching. She came in with 2 cups of coffee, set one next to him without asking, and sat on an upturned bucket nearby. They drank their coffee in silence for a while. "She asked about you," Ruth said. Gideon kept his eyes on the stitching. "What did she ask?" "Whether you were staying on through winter." A pause. "I told her I thought you were." He didn't say anything. "She said that was good," Ruth said, "that the valley needed people who did good work." He looked up then. Ruth was looking at her coffee, but the corner of her mouth had that thing it did. "She's careful," he said. "Yes," Ruth said. "So am I." "I know," Ruth said. "That's why I'm not worried." She stood up, took her cup. "Silas thinks he's hiding that he's been checking your work. He's not hiding it." "No," she agreed. "He's just not announcing it." She paused at the barn door. "He hasn't found anything wrong yet." "He won't," Gideon said. Ruth looked at him for a moment. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think he will." She went back to the house, and Gideon went back to his stitching, and the barn settled around him with its familiar smells of hay and leather and animals. And outside the wind came down from the north, carrying the first real bite of the winter coming. And he felt it through the gaps in the boards, and thought that there were worse things than a cold winter in a place where the work was honest, and the people were real, and the valley didn't ask you for your history. It only wanted to know what you were going to do next. He pulled the thread through the leather and kept working. The storm came in from the northwest on a Thursday night, which was the worst possible night for it, because Thursday was when Silas did his end-of-week inventory and had his hands in every corner of the ranch's accounts, meaning he was distracted and irritable in the specific way of a man who has too many numbers in his head to pay attention to the sky. Ruth saw it coming. She always saw weather before anyone else did. Something about the way the light changed in the west, or the way the cattle bunched without being driven, or just 60 years of living in a place that taught you its moods, whether you wanted to learn them or not. She stood on the porch at 4 in the afternoon and watched the clouds building over the ridgeline and said, to no one in particular, "That's going to be bad." Gideon heard her from the yard. He looked northwest and saw what she saw and spent the next 2 hours doing the things you do when bad weather is coming. Making sure the barn was secure, checking that the cattle in the lower pasture had shelter access, pulling the water line covers before the freeze hit and cracked them. He worked fast and without being asked because there was no time to be asked. And when Silas finally came out of the house at 6 with the realization on his face that something needed doing, most of the immediate things were already done. Silas stood in the yard and looked around at what had been managed. "You did the water lines?" he said. "Yes, sir." "The east barn latch was broken." "I fixed it this afternoon. New pin on the hinge." Silas was quiet for a moment, his hands deep in his coat pockets, the wind already picking up and pulling at the brim of his hat. The Hatcher calf, he said. The one with the bad leg. She's still in the north pasture. Gideon stopped. He'd forgotten the Hatcher calf. She'd been moved to the north pasture 3 days ago because she'd been recovering from a leg injury and needed space from the main herd, which had been rotating through the lower fields. The north pasture was exposed. It had a lean-to shelter at the far end, but the calf's leg was still weak and she'd been struggling to move on rough ground, and the north pasture fence had a section, the one near the creek bend, that came apart in high wind because the posts were old and the ground there was soft from the spring flooding that had never fully drained. If the fence blew out in the storm and the calf panicked and got through, "I'll go get her," Gideon said. "It'll be dark in an hour," Silas said. "I know." Silas looked at the sky, which had gone from building to committed. The temperature had already dropped 8 degrees in the last 90 minutes. Gideon could feel it through his coat. "You take a lamp," Silas said, "and the rope from the south barn. The longer one." "Yes, sir." He had Caleb saddled in 7 minutes. Ruth appeared in the barn doorway with a pair of heavier gloves and a look on her face that was worry she wasn't going to say out loud. He took the gloves. "She's at the far end," Ruth said, "near the creek bend." "I know." "The fence there?" "I know, Ruth." She nodded and stepped back and let him go. He rode north with the lamp hanging from the saddle and the wind already working against him. Not the sustained howl of a real blizzard, but the irregular, punching gusts of a storm still organizing itself, which were in some ways worse because they came from different directions, and you couldn't lean into them steadily. Caleb didn't love it. The horse was experienced enough not to spook, but smart enough to communicate his objections through the tension in his neck and the set of his ears, and Gideon talked to him in the low, continuous way he'd developed over years of asking horses to do things horses considered unreasonable. "I know," he said. "I know. Keep going." The north pasture gate was a quarter-mile past the upper tree line, and by the time he reached it, the light was failing fast, and the first real rain had started. Not the cold mist that had been threatening all day, but actual rain, hard and horizontal, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck immediately and doesn't stop until you're wet through. He unlatched the gate one-handed and rode through and pulled it closed behind him, and stood up in the stirrups to look across the pasture toward the far end. He couldn't see the calf. He could see the lean-to, barely, a dark shape against the darker tree line. He rode toward it, the lamp swinging, throwing irregular light across the wet grass. The pasture was soft underfoot. Caleb's hooves were pulling with each step, the ground giving more than it should, and Gideon slowed him down because a horse with a pulled tendon in this weather was a serious problem he couldn't afford. He was 3/4 of the way across the pasture when the lamplight found the fence. The section near the creek bend had gone. Not all of it. 2 posts were still standing, but the wire between them had come free on one side and folded back on itself in a tangle of barbed coils, and something had gone through it. The grass on the other side of the break was disturbed, pressed down in the way that meant something moving fast and panicked, and there was a smear of dark on one of the wire coils that Gideon did not want to look at, but made himself look at anyway. Blood. Not a lot. Enough. He said a word he normally kept to himself. He tied Caleb to the standing post. The horse objected but obeyed, and took the lamp and ducked through the gap in the wire, careful of the barbs, and followed the trail of pressed grass into the creek brush on the other side. The creek bank was steep here, cut down by spring flooding, and the brush was thick and grabby, and the rain was heavier now, the lamp barely pushing back the dark enough to see 3 feet ahead. He heard her before he saw her, a low, distressed sound that calves make when they're in pain and confused and have been struggling too long. Not a call for the herd, just a sound, the animal equivalent of a person talking to themselves, because the silence is worse. She was in the creek brush, maybe 15 feet down the bank from the fence break, caught in a tangle of deadfall branches and old flood debris. Her bad leg had gone through a gap in the debris, and she'd twisted trying to free herself, and she was down on one side, her breath coming fast and shallow. The wire had caught her across the shoulder. That was the blood. Not deep, a surface tear, but it had scared her, and the fear had made the struggle worse, and the struggle had lodged her deeper in the debris. Gideon set the lamp on a flat piece of bank above the tangle and got down beside her. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey, stop." She didn't stop. She was past listening. Her eyes were white-rimmed and her legs were moving in the weak, desperate way of an animal that has been fighting too long and is running out of fight, but can't stop trying. "Hey," he said again, closer, and put his hand flat on her neck. She flinched, but as she slowed. Animals sometimes respond to a hand that isn't pulling or pushing, just present. He kept his hand there and talked to her in the same low voice he used on Caleb and waited for the breathing to settle from panicked to merely frightened, which took about 3 minutes and felt like 30. When she was still enough, he started working on the debris. The problem wasn't the branches. Those he could move. The problem was the way her leg was lodged, angled in a way that would hurt her when he lifted it. And in the dark and the rain, he couldn't see clearly enough to know exactly what he was working with. He had to do it by feel, which meant slow and careful and wrong twice before he figured out the angle. And by the time he had her leg free, he was on his knees in creek mud with rain running into his collar and down his back, and his right arm was burning from the elbow down in a way he chose not to examine closely. He'd caught his forearm on the wire coming through the fence. He'd known it when it happened, and he'd registered it and set it aside because the calf was more urgent. And now he was aware of it as a constant, specific pain that was trying to get his attention, and he was continuing to not give it. He got the calf's leg free. She lurched up immediately, which he'd expected, and he caught her weight against his chest and held her until she steadied, and then he got his arm under her barrel and lifted. She wasn't small. She was 3 months old and well-fed and weighed a substantial portion of what lifting her asked of him, and what lifting her asked of him was a lot. His right arm screamed. He told it to be quiet and walked her up the bank, one step at a time, her legs finding purchase on the wet ground with the tentative concentration of something relearning a skill. He got her through the fence gap. He got her across the pasture. He got her into the lean-to and checked the wire cut on her shoulder, which was superficial and had already slowed, and checked her bad leg, which was no worse for the adventure, though it would be sore in the morning, and stood there in the lean-to with the rain hammering the roof and his right arm hanging at his side, feeling like it had been disassembled and not quite put back together. He looked at it in the lamplight. It was worse than he'd thought. The barb had caught him on the outer forearm about 4 inches below the elbow and opened a gash that was maybe 3 inches long and still bleeding with the steady, committed patience of a wound that isn't going to stop on its own. His sleeve was soaked through. He hadn't noticed how much until now, because the rain had made everything wet and cold and indistinguishable. He tore a strip from the bottom of his undershirt. He had to use his teeth to start the tear, which was undignified, and wrapped it around his arm as tightly as he could manage one-handed, which was not as tightly as it needed to be, but was the best available option. Then he went and got Caleb, who was deeply unhappy about the whole situation, but had stayed where he was tied, which Gideon considered a personal favor. He rode back to the ranch. The storm was fully committed now, the rain slanting in sheets across the lamplight, and he leaned low over Caleb's neck and lets the horse pick his own path because the horse could see better than he could and was more motivated to get back to the barn. He was cold in the specific way that happens when wet and wind combine with blood loss. A heaviness in the hands, a slight delay in his thoughts, the edges of things going soft. He was fine. He'd been colder. He'd bled more. He was fine. He got to the barn and got Caleb unsaddled and checked and dried and blanketed because you took care of your horse before yourself. That was the rule. That had always been the rule, and he held to it now even with his right arm wrapped in a bloody piece of undershirt and his body temperature still debating its position. He was closing the barn door when Silas appeared out of the rain with a lantern. They stood 3 feet apart in the barn doorway. Silas's eyes went to Gideon's arm. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You got her?" "She's in the lean-to. Wire cut on the shoulder. Not deep. Bad leg didn't get worse." Silas nodded slowly. He kept looking at the arm. "You go through the fence?" "Section by the creek bend came down. I went through the gap." "Barbed wire." "Yes, sir." Another silence. The rain was loud on the barn roof, and the lantern swung in the wind between them, and the light it threw was unsteady. "Come inside," Silas said. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask," Silas said. There was something different in his voice. Gideon registered it and couldn't quite name it. Not softer exactly, but less armored. The particular tone of a man who has been maintaining a position for a long time and has just, quietly, moved. He followed Silas inside. Ruth took one look at his arm and said nothing, which was more alarming than if she'd said something. She sat him at the kitchen table and unwrapped the makeshift bandage with the calm efficiency of a woman who had dealt with ranch injuries for 4 decades and was not easily rattled. And she looked at what was underneath and cleaned it with the whiskey she kept in the kitchen cupboard for exactly this kind of occasion. And Gideon held very still and stared at a point on the far wall. "This needs closing," she said. "It'll close." "Not properly. You'll have a bad scar if it doesn't get closed properly." She paused. "I can do it. I've done it before." He looked at her. "Silas has been sewn up more times than I care to remember," she said. "I know what I'm doing." "All right," he said. It took her 15 minutes and 4 stitches and a steadiness of hand that he would have found remarkable in anyone and found humbling in a 61-year-old woman doing fine needlework by kitchen lamplight in the middle of a storm. He held still the entire time. She made a sound of professional satisfaction when she was done and wrapped the arm in clean linen and tied it off and stepped back to evaluate her work. "You'll live," she said. "Much obliged," he said. Silas had been sitting at the other end of the table this whole time, apparently reading from the ledger he'd been carrying when Gideon came in. He wasn't reading it. The pages hadn't turned once. He was watching, or not quite watching, doing the thing he did where he looked at something else while seeing the thing he actually meant to see. Ruth put the whiskey away. She set a bowl of the evening stew in front of Gideon, who started to protest, and she said, "Don't," in a tone that didn't leave room for further discussion. He ate. After a while, Silas closed the ledger. "Nobody told you to go after that calf," he said. Gideon looked up. "I mean that literally," Silas said. "I told you she was in the north pasture. I didn't tell you to go get her." "You said she was there," Gideon said. "Storm was coming. Someone had to." "I would have gone." "You didn't know about the fence section," Gideon said. "The one by the creek bend. I'd been out there last week. I knew it was weak. You couldn't have known to look there first." Silas was quiet. "If she'd gone through in the dark, and you didn't know where to look—" Gideon stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because it didn't need finishing. "You went through the fence in the dark," Silas said. "The calf went through first." Silas picked up the ledger and set it down again without opening it. He looked at the table. He looked like a man doing arithmetic on something that wasn't numbers. "The work you've been doing on the east fence," he said. "I've been checking it." Gideon said nothing. "It's good work," Silas said. It came out of him the way things come out of men who don't give compliments easily, with a slight compression beforehand, the verbal equivalent of clearing a blocked line. Better than what was there before. "Thank you," Gideon said. "I wasn't—" Silas stopped. Started again. "I've been hard on you." "You've been fair," Gideon said. "I've been suspicious." "Also fair," Gideon said. Silas looked at him sharply. Then something in the sharpness let go, and for a moment Gideon could see the man under the rancher. Older than he performed, tireder, carrying things he'd been carrying for a long time. "You know about Tom Hart," Silas said. "I know he died 2 winters ago," Gideon said. "Beyond that, only what Clara tells me." "She tell you how he died?" "No." Silas was quiet for a moment. Ruth, at the counter, was still. The kind of still that meant she knew what was coming and was giving Silas the room to say it. "Winter fence work," Silas said. "Northridge. Ice on the ground, alone, horse spooked and threw him. By the time anyone found him—" He stopped. The rest of it was there without those words. "He was a good man. Best neighbor I've ever had. I looked after Naomi and Clara that first year because it was right, and because I owed it to Tom and because they needed it." "I understand," Gideon said. "Do you?" It wasn't a question exactly. "Because from where I sit, you've been spending considerable time in the direction of that homestead, and Naomi Hart is not a woman who has an easy time with trust, and Clara is not a child who needs another man to show up and then not stay." The kitchen was very quiet. The storm was still working outside, but it felt distant now, less present than the things being said at this table. Gideon put down his spoon. He looked at Silas Mercer directly. Not challenging, not performing, just the steady look of a man who doesn't flinch from necessary conversations. "I know what's at stake," he said. "I'm not moving fast because I know what's at stake. I'm not making promises to anyone because I believe in knowing what you can carry before you pick it up." "And do you?" Silas said. "Know what you can carry?" "I'm starting to," Gideon said. "I haven't been sure of much in my life, Silas. but I know bad intentions from good ones. Mine are good. Whatever else I am or have been, they're good." The old man looked at him for a long time, long enough that Gideon didn't try to fill the silence, just let it sit there and be what it was. "Where were you before Wyoming?" Silas said. "New Mexico, 2 years. Before that?" "Colorado, about a year. Before that a stretch in Kansas I'd rather not repeat." "Why'd you leave each place?" "Seasonal work ended. Once because the ranch sold. Once because the owner died and the family didn't keep the land." He paused. "I've never left because of trouble." "I wired Harlan," Silas said. "I know. He told me you did." Silas blinked. "He told you?" "He mentioned it when I came up here. Syed, a Montana rancher, had written asking about me, and that he'd told the truth, which was that I was a good hand and an honest man, and that if he had more land he'd have kept me on." Gideon looked at the table. "He also told me I needed to stop drifting before I drifted so long I forgot what stopping felt like." Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is that what's happening here? Remembering what stopping feels like?" Gideon was honest. "Maybe. I don't know yet. But I'm not pretending I do." The storm outside made a particularly violent statement about its existence. A gust that rattled the window frames and sent something skittering across the porch roof. All three of them looked up reflexively, then back down. "The calf will be cold in that lean-to," Silas said. "She's got enough shelter. Her temp was okay when I left her." "Leg?" "Didn't look worse. She'll be sore." He paused. "I'll go out first thing and check her." "I'll go with you," Silas said. It was the most ordinary sentence in the world. He said it the way you say things that have been decided without an announcement. Gideon registered it and kept his face even. "All right," he said. Ruth turned from the counter and caught Gideon's eye for just a fraction of a second. The look on her face was not triumphant. It was the look of someone who has been patient long enough to see something that patience was required for, and finds the patience was worth it, and doesn't need to say so. He was in the bunkhouse by 9, arm throbbing with the reliable honesty of something that had been properly closed and would heal correctly, which was more than he could say for some wounds. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the storm thinning out. It was past its worst, running out of commitment, the way storms did when they'd said their piece. Rain on the roof, steady and lighter now, something that was almost comfortable to listen to once the worst was over. He thought about Silas's question. Is that what's happening? Remembering what stopping feels like. He thought about Clara, who held the ladder, who didn't tell her mother she'd seen the crying over the books, who had looked at him on the trail with those dark, serious eyes and decided he was safe before she had any real evidence, and had been right, and seemed to know she'd been right without needing to make anything of it. He thought about Naomi saying he sounds like someone worth missing, talking about her husband, and the way she'd then gone briefly and obviously elsewhere in her own mind, visiting something she kept private and protected, and the way she'd come back from it with her chin set and her voice even because she had decided a long time ago that falling apart was a thing she did on her own time. He thought about the apple preserves. He thought about the coffee in the small house with the barnboard shelves. He thought about the fox drawing on the wall. He put his good arm behind his head and stared at the bunkhouse ceiling he knew by heart now. The knot in the third board from the left, the place where the pitch pine had bled through and left a dark stain shaped roughly like a boot. And he tried to imagine as an honest exercise what it would mean to stop. Not stopping here, just stopping. Picking a place and staying in it and putting down whatever the opposite of roots was that he'd been growing his whole adult life. The trying didn't scare him the way it once had. That was new. He fell asleep listening to and in the morning, when he woke, the storm was over and the sky was the specific scrubbed blue that only exists the day after bad weather, and he dressed carefully around his bandaged arm and went out to check on the calf. Silas was already at the barn, saddling his own horse. He looked up when Gideon came in, assessed the arm with a glance, and said nothing about it. They rode north together. The north pasture looked the way everything looks after a storm. A little damaged, a little relieved, the evidence of what had passed written in small destructions across the landscape. The creek was up. The lean-to had held. The calf was standing when they got to her, favoring the bad leg but upright. Her shoulder wound dried and closed, her eyes tracking them with the alert suspicion of an animal that has recently had a very bad night and has decided to be cautious about mornings. Silas got off his horse and checked her over with careful, experienced hands. He ran his fingers along the wire cut, checked the leg, watched her put weight on it. "She'll do," he said. "Yes," Gideon said. Silas stood up and looked at the broken fence section. Then he looked at the creek bank and the brush, and whatever trail was still visible in the mud from the night before. He didn't say anything for a moment. "She went pretty far into that brush," he said. "Yes, sir." "In the dark. In that rain." "She was scared. Scared animals go further than they mean to." Silas looked at the bank. He was putting it together. The fence, the dark, the rain, what the creek bank looked like in good conditions, and what it would have been like last night. What it would have taken to go down it with a lamp and find her and get her out. He didn't say anything about it, but he turned from the bank to Gideon and looked at him with an expression that was different from any Gideon had seen on him yet. Not warm, exactly, not approving exactly, but the expression of a man who has finished doing arithmetic and arrived at an answer he didn't expect and is deciding what to do with it. "Let's fix that fence section before we head back," Silas said. "I've got staples in my saddlebag," Gideon said. "Of course you do," Silas said without irony, and went to get the wire stretcher from his own pack. They worked the fence together in the cold morning air, the two of them, without much conversation, the way men work when the work itself is the conversation. Silas was strong for his age and knew his way around wire and post with the economy of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Gideon worked alongside him, matching his pace, not performing and not holding back. When the section was tight and the posts were solid, Silas stood back and put his hands on his hips and looked at it. "She's going to wonder about you," he said. Gideon coiled the leftover wire without looking up. "She already does," he said. "I don't know what to do about that yet." "I do," Silas said. He picked up his wire stretcher. "But I'm not going to tell you. You'll figure it out or you won't." "That's not particularly helpful," Gideon said. "No," Silas agreed, "but it's honest." They rode back in the clean morning, the valley opening up below them as they came down from the north ridge. The Mercer Ranch visible in the distance with smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and somewhere east of it, past the aspens and the creek, the Halcott homestead with its blue door and its flower boxes, sitting in the long morning light like something that had been waiting with more patience than it had any obligation to show. Silas didn't say anything to Naomi right away. That wasn't his way. He turned things over the way he turned soil, slowly, with attention to what was underneath, not rushing to plant before the ground was ready. He spent 3 days after the storm doing what he always did when he was working something out, which was physical labor that didn't require conversation. He mended the tool shed roof. He sorted the winter feed inventory. He replaced 2 rotted boards in the horse stall that had been on his list since August. Ruth watched him do all of it and said nothing. She had been married to this man for 38 years, and she knew the difference between productive silence and the silence that precedes a decision. This was the second kind. She gave it room. On the 4th day, Silas came in from the barn at mid-morning, which was unusual, poured himself coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table where Ruth was mending a split in one of his work shirts. "I'm going to go see Naomi," he said. Ruth kept her eyes on the mending. "All right. I want to talk to her about the winter supplies. She's going to be short on feed if that storm was the first of several." "She probably knows that," Ruth said. "Probably," Silas said. He drank his coffee. "I might mention Gideon while I'm there." Ruth set down the shirt. She looked at him with the level attention of a woman who has waited for something and is watching it finally arrive. "What are you going to say about him?" she said. Silas looked at his hands around the cup. "That he's a good man. That I think he's a good man." He said the second sentence as if it was a correction of the first. More specific, more committed. "That she should make her own mind up, but that if she's been wondering what I think, that's what I think." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "Good." "I'm not matchmaking," Silas said. "Of course not," Ruth said, and picked up the shirt again. He drove the wagon over to the Halcott homestead that afternoon. Naomi was outside splitting wood. She had a systematic approach to it, working through the pile with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd learned to pace themselves through long tasks. She saw him coming and stuck the axe in the stump and waited with her hands on her hips, which was how she always greeted visitors, a habit that some people read as defensive and Silas had always read as honest. He helped her carry the feed order discussion through, and they talked prices and storage, and she showed him where the north side of her barn roof had taken damage in the storm. A section about 4 feet long where the sheeting had peeled back and been temporarily patched with tarp and wire. She'd done the temporary patch herself. Of course she had. "I'll send someone to fix that properly before the next snow," Silas said. "I can—" "Naomi." She closed her mouth. "I'll send someone," he said. She nodded once, accepting it the way she accepted help. Not gracefully, not easily, but completely. Because she was practical enough to know the difference between pride and foolishness. They were standing at the barn doorway looking at the roof when Silas said, "Gideon could fix that in a morning." The name landed in the conversation and stayed there. Naomi looked at the damaged roof section and didn't say anything for a moment. "I imagine he could," she said. "He's good at roofs," Silas said. "He did mine last month. Did the sheeting and the flashing both. I haven't had a leak in the northeast corner since 1987. "Is that your endorsement?" she said. She was looking at the roof, but there was something careful and alert in the way she held herself. "It's a fact," Silas said. "What you do with it is your business." She was quiet. Then she turned from the roof and looked at him directly. "Why are you telling me this, Silas?" He could have said something indirect. He was capable of it. He'd been direct and indirect in equal measure his whole life, depending on what the situation called for. But he looked at Naomi Hart, this woman who had built a life out of the rubble of a grief that would have leveled most people, who split her own wood and patched her own roofs and raised her daughter alone and still managed to put up apple preserves in the fall, because that was the kind of person she was. And he decided she deserved directness. "Because I wasn't fair to him at the start," he said. "I was watching him for the wrong reasons. Or, the reasons were right, but I was looking for failure when I should have been looking for character. There's a difference." "And what did you find?" she said. "When you were looking for character?" "You already know what I found," he said. "You've been watching too." She looked away, toward the aspens at the east edge of her property, the bare-limbed November trees with their white bark going gray in the flat winter light. "He's careful," she said. "He moves slowly." "Yes. Sometimes I can't tell if that's respect or reluctance." "In my experience," Silas said, "men who are reluctant don't fix your pump and check your fence line and ride out in the dark after somebody else's calf." He paused. "That's not reluctance. That's a man who doesn't want to do harm." Naomi stood with that for a moment. A crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard and regarded them both with the philosophical indifference of a crow, and then departed. "Clara talks about him constantly," she said quietly. "She tries not to, but she does. She thinks she's being subtle." "She's 7, Silas said. "Subtle develops later." "She asked me last week if drifters always drift forever, or if sometimes they stop." Naomi's voice was steady, but something in it was doing the work of staying that way. She said she was just wondering, as a general question. Silas said nothing. "She's already attached," Naomi said. "That's what worries me. Not me, her." She looked back at the roof. "If he moves on in the spring, she's going to take it hard. She's already lost one person she depended on." "I know," Silas said. "I'm not saying that to be difficult. I'm saying it because it's real." "I know," he said again. "Ask him." She looked at him. "What?" "Ask him directly. Whatever you need to know. He's not a man who'll give you a rehearsed answer." Silas picked up his hat, which he'd been holding since they walked out of the barn. "Ruth says the same thing, that when he says something, he means it and only it. No performance in it." He put the hat on. "That's a rarer quality than people think." He drove home and didn't say much about it to Ruth, only that he'd gone and talked to her. And Ruth, who had developed over decades the useful ability to extract a complete story from 3 sentences, nodded and went back to her bread and didn't ask follow-up questions. 3 days later, on a bright cold Friday that felt like winter had finally committed to its position, Gideon rode over to the Halcott homestead with a canvas bag of roofing materials Silas had put together and left in the barn without comment. He hadn't been sent. No one had told him to go. He'd seen the bag in the barn with a note in Silas's handwriting that said the Halcott barn roof needed sheeting and listed the materials, and he'd put it together and gone, which was perhaps not the world's most indirect development, but it was how it happened. Naomi was inside when he rode up. She came out when she heard Caleb and stood on the porch with her arms folded. Not against him, but against the cold. and she looked at the canvas bag on his saddle and then at him. Silas mentioned the roof, he said. Did he? She said. I brought materials. I see that. A pause. The wind moved through the aspens with the thin, papery sound of bare November branches. Is it all right if I take a look? He said. She stepped off the porch. Come on. He spent the better part of the morning on the barn roof. It was straightforward work. Pull the tarp, assess the damage, resheet the section, seal the flashing properly so it would hold through freeze-thaw cycles. The kind of work that is entirely functional and requires no particular conversation, which suited both of them, though for reasons that were different and possibly the same. Naomi brought him coffee mid-morning. She handed it up to him from the top of the ladder. He reached down and took it without coming off the roof, which required a certain flexibility in his situation with the bandaged arm, and she noticed him favor the right arm and said nothing about it immediately. Then, how's the arm? Healing. Ruth told me what happened with the calf. Ruth talks, he said. Ruth cares, Naomi corrected. There's a difference. She held on to the ladder and looked up at him. You could have had serious trouble on that creek bank, alone in that rain. Calf would have been in worse trouble. That's not the point I'm making. He looked down at her from the roof. She was looking up at him with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not quite managing it, something underneath it that was concern she hadn't intended to show and now couldn't quite recall. I know, he said. He held her gaze. I'm all right, Naomi. She looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Then she went back to the house. Clara appeared at noon with a plate of sandwiches and the focused energy of a child who has been told she can deliver lunch, but must not linger, and has decided that the instruction about not lingering is open to interpretation. She handed him the plate and sat on the fence rail and watched him eat with the frank, assessing attention she brought to everything. Mama made those, she said. She used the good bread. Tell her thank you. You can tell her yourself, Clara said. She's in the kitchen. A pause. She's been in the kitchen all morning. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the innocence of someone who has said a true thing and is not responsible for what you do with it. How's school? He said. Fine. We're doing long division. She wrinkled her nose. It's very long. It gets shorter, he said. Once you understand the pattern. Do you like math? I use it every day. Fence lines, feed calculations, whether the water table's dropping. He handed her back the empty plate. It's not pretty, but it's useful. My daddy said everything useful is beautiful if you look at it right, Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. He was right. She looked at the roof, then at him. Are you going to fix the whole thing? Just the bad section. The rest is sound. Mama's been putting a bucket under it when it rains. She said this with the factual directness of someone reporting a field condition. She moves the bucket between the stall and the feed room depending on where it's dripping worst. It won't drip after today. Clara seemed to evaluate this assurance and find it sufficient. Good, she said, and took the plate back to the house. I was finishing the flashing when Naomi came back out. She stood below and looked up at the completed section with the evaluating eye of a woman who had been managing a property alone long enough to know the difference between work done quickly and work done right. That's better than what was there before the storm, she said. Previous sheeting was due to go anyway. I replaced a little more than what was damaged. How much do I owe you? Nothing. Gideon? The materials were Silas's, he said. The time was mine. Neither of us is charging you. She put her hands on her hips. I don't like charity. It's not charity, he said. Neighbors fix each other's roofs. That's just what it is. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has a response prepared and is deciding whether to use it. Then she didn't use it. Come in for lunch, she said. Proper lunch, not sandwiches. He came down off the roof. He washed his hands at the pump and came inside and sat at the same table where he'd had coffee 6 weeks ago. And the books were still on the barnboard shelves, and the fox drawing was still on the wall, and there was a new one next to it. A horse that was recognizably Caleb, done in the brown crayon that was closest to bay, with a careful attention to the ear angle that was genuinely observant for a 7-year-old. Clara did that, Naomi said, following his gaze. Last week. She got the ears right, he said. She spent 20 minutes looking at him through the window before she drew it. Naomi set a bowl of soup in front of him. She said she wanted to get them exactly right because he had specific ears. He does, Gideon said. He knows things by his ears before his eyes catch up. Clara appeared from the back room where she'd apparently been doing homework, assessed the situation at the table, and sat down with the seamless confidence of someone who considers herself a full participant in any room she's in. I drew your horse, she said. I saw. You got the ears right. Clara looked pleased but contained it. I almost drew you too, but I didn't know what to do with the hat. The hat's tricky, he agreed. Naomi ate across from him with the particular self-consciousness of someone trying not to be self-conscious, which is its own very human and visible condition. She asked him about the ranch, about whether Silas was planning to bring on extra hands for the winter, about the feed situation in the valley after the storm. Practical questions. The kind that don't require anything of you emotionally, but keep the conversation real and grounded and moving. He answered them straightforwardly. He told her about the hatcher calf, who was recovering well. He told her about the winter feed estimates and which ranches were better positioned and which ones were going to have a hard go of it. He talked to her the way he talked to people when he was actually comfortable, which was without performance, without filling silence for the sake of it, with the willingness to let a pause be a pause. Clara fell asleep at the table sometime after lunch, her head on her folded arms, her homework pushed to the side. It happened with the sudden completeness that children's sleep happens. One moment present, next moment gone. Naomi got up quietly and got a blanket from somewhere and put it around her without waking her, with the practiced economy of someone who had done this exact thing many times. She came back to the table and sat down, and they were alone in the room in the particular way that is different from being in a room with a sleeping child and being in a room by yourselves, but is not completely different. Silas came to see me, she said. I thought he might, Gideon said. He told me you were a good man. That was generous of him. He's not a generous man, she said. He's an accurate one. There's a difference. She looked at her coffee cup. He told me to ask you directly if I had questions. That sounds like him, Gideon said. She looked up. Are you planning to stay? The question was clean and unadorned, which was the only way she knew how to ask important things. He had expected something like it, and had still not entirely decided what to say, and he sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with anything that deserved honesty rather than a quick answer. I don't have a reason to leave, he said. I haven't had a reason like that in a long time. He looked at her. And I'm starting to have reasons to stay. That's a different thing from planning, but it's real. She held his gaze. Claire's attached to you. I know. She doesn't attach easily. She's been careful since Tom died. She's a careful kid, he said. She was careful even on the trail when she was scared. She doesn't give herself away easily. No, Naomi said. She doesn't. A pause. She got that from Tom. The carefulness. She looked at the table. She got the fox following from me, unfortunately. He almost smiled. The fox following isn't the worst quality. It got her lost on a trail with a man who... She stopped herself. The sentence closed before it finished. But it also got her found, he said quietly. Naomi looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of scenes in stories where everything becomes clear at once. Just a small movement, like a door that has been held almost closed, finally releasing the last inch. Yes, she said. It did. The afternoon light was going by the time he got up to leave. Clara was still asleep, her breathing the deep, uncomplicated breathing of a child who has burned through the day's energy and surrendered to it completely. Naomi walked him to the door, and they stood on the porch in the cold and the thin late afternoon sun that was already halfway behind the ridge. The roof will hold, he said. I know, she said. Thank you, not just for today. He put on his hat. Can I come back Saturday? She looked at him. What's Saturday? Nothing specific, he said. I'd just like to come back. A pause. Longer than comfortable, shorter than impossible. Claire and I usually bake on Saturday mornings, she said. She's been making biscuits with varying levels of success. I like biscuits, he said. Even bad ones? Especially bad ones, he said. They have more character. Naomi looked at him for a moment with that expression he was beginning to be able to read, the one where she was deciding whether to let something show or keep it managed. This time, she let a little of it show. Not much. Enough. Saturday, then, she said. He rode back to the Mercer Ranch in the early dusk, the valley going purple and gold around him, Caleb moving at his own preferred pace, which was slightly faster going home than going out, as horses always were. The arm was still sore, but the kind of sore that told him it was healing correctly. He felt, overall, something that he would not have called happiness, because that was a big word he'd learned to be careful with, but something adjacent to it, something that was the opposite of the feeling of leaving a place. He got back to the barn and was unsaddling Caleb when Silas came in. The old rancher looked at the canvas bag, now empty of materials, and at Gideon's general condition, which was cold and dusty and barn dirty from the roof work. "Roof's done?" Silas said. "Yes, sir. She won't drip." Silas nodded. He took the empty canvas bag and folded it and set it on the shelf. He went to the stall door and looked at his own horse for a moment, for no apparent reason. "She feed you?" he said. "Soup and bread." "Good." He kept looking at the horse. "Clara there?" "Fell asleep at the table after lunch." Silas made a sound. Not a laugh exactly, something smaller. "She used to do that at our table when she was smaller," he said. "Before Tom died, she'd eat and then just go." He shook his head. Ruth would carry her to the truck and drive her home, and she'd wake up in her own bed with no memory of the transition. Gideon finished with Caleb and came out of the stall. He and Silas stood in the barn in the way they'd been standing for months. Not quite easy with each other, not uncomfortable either, in the particular negotiated space of two men who have not yet decided they're friends, but have stopped deciding they aren't. "I'm going back Saturday," Gideon said. Silas looked at him. "I wanted to tell you directly," Gideon said. "Not because I need your permission, because you've been straight with me and I owe you the same." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You ask her, or did she ask you?" "I asked her." "And she said yes." "She said Saturday." Silas absorbed this. He picked up a brush from the tack shelf and turned it over in his hands for no particular reason. "Tom used to say she had more patience than she let on," he said, "that she just needed the right reason to use it." "She strikes me that way," Gideon said. "She's not easy," Silas said. "I mean that in the best sense. She's got requirements, standards. She knows what she believes, and she doesn't bend it for convenience." He set the brush down. "She'll ask hard questions." "Good," Gideon said. Silas looked at him. Then he did something Gideon hadn't expected. He extended his hand. Not with warmth or ceremony, just cleanly, the way a man extends his hand when something has been settled between them. Gideon shook it. "Don't hurt them," Silas said. "No, sir," Gideon said. "That's all I needed to hear." He went toward the barn door, then stopped. "Ruth's been holding a good whiskey for an occasion she said she'd know when she saw it." He paused. "She saw it last week. It's been waiting for you to get around to things." He went out. Gideon stood in the barn with Caleb behind him, making the contented sounds of a horse well-fed and warmly stabled, and the wind outside doing the thing it did in Montana in November, which was remind you constantly of its presence, without necessarily doing anything about it. And he felt the weight of something that had been pending for months finally, quietly, set down. It wasn't resolution, nothing was resolved. He was going back on Saturday to eat questionable biscuits with a woman who would ask him hard questions, and a child who had drawn his horse's ears from memory, and whatever came after that would come after that. Life didn't hand you the whole road at once. It handed you the next thing and expected you to be present for it. He was learning to be present. It was harder than leaving and better than he'd expected. He blew out the barn lamp and went inside, where Ruth was waiting with the whiskey and the expression of a woman who has been right about something for long enough that she no longer needs to say so. The Saturday biscuits were, as advertised, not good. Clara had made them with great confidence and insufficient attention to the ratio of baking powder to flour, which resulted in something that was architecturally impressive. They held their shape with unusual conviction, but texturally closer to a river stone than anything you'd want to eat voluntarily. She set them on the table with the expression of someone presenting work they are proud of, and Gideon took one and ate it without hesitation and said it was the best biscuit he'd had all week, which was technically true because he hadn't had any other biscuits that week. And Clara was sharp enough that he suspected she caught the precision of the claim, but she let it go because the spirit was right. Naomi ate hers with coffee and said nothing except, "Not bad for a second attempt," which Clara accepted as the qualified victory it was. That was the beginning of Saturdays. Not every Saturday went that way. Some went badly. Clara had a morning in December where she was unreachable with grief about something small that was really about something large, and she sat at the table with her arms folded and her face shut and refused to talk. And Gideon had the wisdom to not push and the patience to stay anyway, which was its own kind of answer to a question nobody had asked out loud yet. Naomi watched him not push and not leave, and something in her settled further, the way ground settles after it's been properly watered. Some Saturdays were ordinary in the particular way that ordinary becomes precious when you haven't had enough of it. They fixed things around the homestead, or helped Clara with her schoolwork, or just sat in the kitchen while the stove kept the cold out, and the conversation moved where it wanted to move without anyone steering it. December hardened into the serious cold that Montana does when it means it. The kind of cold that is not atmospheric but structural. It gets into the buildings, into the wood, into the animals, into the decisions you make about what's worth going outside for and what can wait. Gideon split wood for the Halcott homestead 3 times that month, always when Naomi was otherwise occupied, always without announcement, so that she would come outside and find it done and have to make a small private decision about what she felt about that. She felt something. She didn't name it yet. She was a woman who had learned the hard way through the specific education of loss, that naming things too early could put weight on them before they were strong enough to carry it. But she stopped arguing when he brought the wood. Christmas came and went quietly. The Mercer Ranch had the Hearts over for Christmas dinner, which Ruth organized with the competence of a general and the warmth of someone who genuinely wanted everyone at her table. It was the first time all of them had been in the same room together with no particular work as pretext, and it had the slight self-consciousness of any gathering where the relationships are still finding their shape. Silas was more talkative than usual, which was his version of making an effort. Clara ate 2 pieces of pie and fell asleep on the settle in the front room before sunset. Naomi helped Ruth with the dishes, and they talked in the kitchen for 40 minutes, and whatever they said in there stayed in there. But when Naomi came out, she looked like someone who had set something down that she'd been carrying at an awkward angle. Gideon and Silas sat by the window and looked out at the snow and talked about the spring herd rotation in the way men talk about practical things when they are actually talking about the fact that they have made peace with each other. "I'm thinking of bringing on a second permanent hand in April," Silas said. "You've got enough work for 3, Gideon said. "I know it. I've been stubborn about the cost." He looked at the snow. "Ruth says I've been stubborn about several things, and I'm coming around on most of them." Gideon said nothing. "The east section would support another family," Silas said, "if someone was of a mind to build there. The water rights come with the land and the creek doesn't flood past the second marker." Gideon looked at him. "I'm talking about geography," Silas said, with the straightness of a man who is absolutely not only talking about geography. "I understand that," Gideon said. "Good," Silas said, and picked up his coffee. The east section. Gideon had ridden it 100 times by now. He knew where the ground was firm and where it went soft, knew which slope caught the morning sun longest in winter, knew there was a natural windbreak in the tree line on the north side that would make a building site practical even in the worst season. He'd known these things for weeks without letting himself know why he'd been paying attention. He let himself know now. January was the hardest month, the way January always is. The holidays are over, the cold has lost its novelty, and the distance between where you are and where you want to be feels longest. Gideon had a bad week in the middle of it where everything seemed to require more effort than it returned, the way sometimes happens to a man who has spent too long being alone and is learning to be otherwise, which involves a particular kind of awkward readjustment that nobody talks about honestly. He said the wrong thing to Naomi on a Wednesday. They'd been talking about the spring, about what she was planning for the East Garden, and he'd made a suggestion about the fence line that came out sounding more like a decision than a suggestion, and she went quiet in the specific way she went quiet when something had landed wrong. Not angry, not hurt exactly, just withdrawn, which was worse because it was harder to address. He recognized it immediately and sat with it for a moment, which was the hardest part, resisting the impulse to explain or justify or paper over it. "That came out wrong," he said. "I meant to ask, not tell." She looked at him. "The fence line is yours," he said. "All of it. I've got opinions, but they're not requirements." She was quiet for another moment. Then, I know you didn't mean it the way it sounded. Doesn't matter what I meant, he said. Matters what you heard. She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. Tom had been a good man and she had loved him, and there were 10,000 things about him she missed with a physical ache that hadn't fully left. But Tom had been a man who doubled down when he said things wrong, not from cruelty, just from the stubborn pride of someone who didn't like being caught making errors. It had been their most consistent friction. She had learned to wait it out. Thank you, she said. I'll ask next time, he said. Yes, she said. Do that. They had dinner, and the conversation moved on, and the fence line question got resolved by actual discussion rather than unilateral suggestion. And it was fine. It was better than fine. It was the kind of small navigation that tells you more about two people than any number of clean, easy moments. He drove home in the cold night with the stars doing what Montana stars do in January, which is assert themselves with a thoroughness that reminds you of your dimensions. And he felt, alongside the cold and the dark, something that was not perfect but was functional and real and growing at a rate he trusted precisely because it was slow. February brought Dale Pruitt back into the story. It came through the valley grapevine the way things come through small communities, partially, sideways, requiring assembly. What Gideon pieced together from 3 conversations over the course of a week was that Pruitt had been moving through the valley under the premise of buying up land cheaply from struggling operations, that his methods were not entirely legal and not entirely not legal, but existed in the gray space that men like him had always operated in, and that he had been seen twice in the area around the Halcott homestead asking questions about the property's status and Naomi Hart's situation. Gideon heard this and held it for 2 days without doing anything because he wanted to know what he actually thought before he did anything, and because his first instinct was to go directly to Pruitt and make his feelings known in a way that would be satisfying and counterproductive. His second instinct was better. He went to Silas. Silas listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when he was taking something seriously. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I know Pruitt, Silas said. Not personally, by reputation. He's been through 2 other valleys the last 10 years. He doesn't buy land. He pressures people into selling it below value and then turns it over. He looks for widows and struggling operations. Naomi's homestead is viable, Gideon said. She's not struggling. She's a woman alone with a child and she doesn't have a man's name on the deed, Silas said flatly, not as an opinion, but as a fact about how certain men operate. To Pruitt, that's enough. Gideon looked at the table. What's the legal standing? The deed is sound. Tom filed everything correctly before he died. It's her land clean and clear. Silas paused. But Pruitt doesn't usually come at people legally. He comes at them sideways, rumors about water rights, suggestions about the title, enough doubt to make a person feel less certain than they should. She needs to know he's asking around, Gideon said. Yes, Silas said. She does. I'll tell her. Silas looked at him. How? Straight, Gideon said. That's the only way she takes anything. He rode over that afternoon. Naomi was in the barn when he arrived, and he told her directly. Pruitt had been in the valley, had been asking about her property, and she should know. He told her what Silas had said about the man's methods. He laid it out flat, without escalating it into something larger than it was, but without softening it either. She listened without interrupting. Her face did what her face did under pressure. Went very still, the expression compressing inward. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. He came by once, she said, in November. I thought he was just passing. He asked about the water rights on the east side, and I told him there was no issue with the water rights, and he left. She looked at the barn wall. He didn't feel right. I should have said something. You didn't know, Gideon said. I should have trusted what I felt. You do that now, he said. That's what matters. She looked at him. What do I do? Nothing, right now. Your deed is sound. Silas says it's clean. If Pruitt approaches you again, don't engage, don't argue, don't explain. Just tell him the land's not available and close the conversation. He paused. And tell me or Silas immediately if it goes beyond that. I don't need men to manage my problems, she said, and there was an edge in it. I know that, he said, without backing off or apologizing for being there. But you don't have to manage them alone either. That's not the same thing. She held his gaze for a long moment. No, she said finally. It's not. Pruitt made one more pass. In late February, he appeared at the edge of the Halcott property on a Monday morning, coming up the east track on his dark wagon. The same missing board off the back, Gideon noted, as if the man couldn't be bothered to fix even the most visible things about himself. Naomi saw him from the house and sent Clara to the back room with instructions to do her reading, and she went out and stood on the porch and waited. Pruitt pulled up and tipped his hat with the particular courtesy of a man who uses courtesy as a tactic. "Morning, Mrs. Hart. Thought I'd check in, see if you'd had time to consider—" "I have," she said. "The answer is no." "Now, I haven't even—" "The land's not available," she said. "It wasn't in November and it isn't now. I won't be answering this question a third time." Pruitt smiled the smile of a man adjusting his approach. "You're in a difficult position here, running this place alone. I'm trying to offer you a way out that— I'm not looking for a way out." Her voice was even. "I'm looking at you from my own porch on my own land, and I'm telling you we're done talking. Have a good morning." She went inside. She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen with her back to the door and her hands flat on the table and breathed through the adrenaline of it, which felt like swallowing something sharp. Clara appeared in the doorway of the back room. "Was that the man from November?" she said. "Yes." "Is he gone?" Naomi looked out the window. The dark wagon was turning around at the end of the track. "Yes," she said. "He's gone. He didn't come back." Whatever Pruitt's calculation was, it apparently didn't include women who answered questions from their own porch, with that particular quality of finality. He moved on to easier ground, and the valley eventually stopped talking about him. And within a month he was a story people told at the general store and then stopped telling because it had run out of new things to say. But the episode left something behind in Gideon. Not anger exactly, but a sharpened clarity about what mattered. He spent a week turning things over and arrived at the same place he'd been moving toward since October, which was that he had been taking his time for good reasons, and those reasons had served their purpose, and the time for taking time was over. He asked Silas about the east section properly in March. Not sideways, not as a hypothetical. He sat across from the old rancher at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening after dinner and said that if Silas was serious about what he'd said at Christmas, he'd like to talk about it seriously. Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he got up and got the land map from the study. A large paper thing, much folded and refolded, annotated in pencil over 20 years. And they spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with Ruth occasionally adding something from the chair by the stove where she was pretending to read. The east section was viable. The water rights were clean. The soil was workable. It would take a building season to put up a proper house, but there was an existing structure, an old line cabin, that could be made livable for one winter with work. "What are you proposing?" Silas said. "That I buy it," Gideon said, "at fair value. I've got savings, 12 years of ranch wages with nowhere particular to spend them." He looked at the map. "I want to do it right. Land in my name, deal done properly, no favors." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "You haven't asked her yet." "No." "You're buying land before you've asked her." "I'm buying land because it's a good piece of land and I intend to be here regardless," Gideon said. "What she says is separate from that." Ruth turned a page in her book that she wasn't reading. "That's either very confident or very foolish," Silas said. "Probably both," Gideon said. "I'm all right with that." Silas looked at the map. He looked at Gideon. Then he put out his hand again, the same way he'd put it out in the barn last November. Clean, direct, no ceremony. They shook on it. He asked Naomi on a Saturday in April when the snow had finally gone soft, and the first actual green was showing in the south-facing pastures, and the valley smelled like itself again instead of like winter. He didn't plan it elaborately. He had thought about planning it elaborately, and then thought about Naomi, who would find that suspicious and possibly alarming, and decided that the right way to ask her was the same way she asked him things, straight, with no performance. Clara was at school. He came over in the morning, and they were looking at the east garden together. She'd been planning what to plant and where, and he'd been helping her think through the water access, which was the practical reason he was there. When he said, without preamble, "I bought the east section from Silas," Naomi stopped. She looked at him. "The one past the aspens," he said. 12 acres and the water rights. There's a line cabin on it that I'm going to rebuild through the summer." "You bought land," she said. "Yes." "Here." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone assembling information. When did you do this? 3 weeks ago. I wanted it to be done before I said anything. He looked at her steadily. I wanted you to know that I'm here because I'm here, not because of what you say next. Something moved across her face. What do I say next? I'm asking you to marry me, he said. Not because I need the land to make sense, or because Clara needs a father, or because it's the practical arrangement. Because I want to be your family, you and Clara. That's what I want. He paused. I know what it costs you to trust someone with that. I know it's not a small thing you'd be deciding. I'm not asking for a quick answer. She was quiet. The wind came through the aspens with the soft sound it made in April when the leaves were just coming back, nothing like the bare branch rattle of November, something new and tentative. A meadowlark said something somewhere in the pasture. Everything was very ordinary and very still. I'm not going to give you a quick answer, she said. I know. I need to talk to Clara. Of course. And I need to... She stopped. I need to sit with it. Not because I don't know what I feel, because what I feel is big, and I don't handle big things quickly. I never have. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. How long have you known what you wanted? Since October, he said. Maybe before. I was slow to admit it to myself. October, she said quietly. Something in her face went briefly private. She was doing arithmetic of her own, counting back. The pump. Before the pump, he said. She looked at the garden. She looked at the aspens. She looked at him. Give me a week, she said. He nodded and went home. The week was the longest week of the previous several years of his life, which was information about how much he'd changed since September. He worked. He worked hard and methodically, and he did not go to the Halcott homestead, and he did not ask Silas or Ruth what they thought, because they were not the ones deciding, and involving them further would have been pressure-dressed as conversation. He chopped wood he didn't need. He fixed a gate that wasn't broken. He reorganized the south barn with an attention to detail that bordered on compulsive. On Thursday, Clara appeared at the east gate. She was alone, as she often was when she came on her own, and she had the expression of someone conducting official business. She stopped in front of him and looked up and said, without introduction, She told me. I figured, he said. She didn't tell me what she was going to say, Clara said. She told me what you asked. She said it was my decision, too. She looked at him with those dark, serious eyes that had been doing this to him since the first day on the trail. Is that true? That it's my decision, too? Yes, he said. Even if I said no? Even then. She was quiet, working through something. I don't want to say no, she said finally. I want to say yes. But I needed to ask you something first. Ask. Do you actually want to be my father? She said. Not because you want to marry Mama, because you want that specifically, to be my father. The question was so precise and so honest, and so exactly the right question that it stopped him fully, which she seemed to understand was not hesitation, but respect for what she'd asked. Yes, he said, specifically, not as a consequence of something else, as its own reason. Clara looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating attention she'd been giving him for months. Okay, she said. Okay? I already told Mama yes, she said, but I needed to ask you myself. She turned to go, then stopped. She's home now if you want to come over. Now? She's been in the garden for 2 hours, Clara said. She doesn't garden that long unless she's thinking. She paused. She's done thinking, you can tell. He saddled Caleb in less time than he usually took and rode to the Halcott homestead and found Naomi in the garden exactly as Clara had described, kneeling in the turned soil, her hands dirty, her hair coming down from its pins, looking up when she heard him coming with an expression that had stopped managing itself and was just what it was. He got down from the horse. She stood up. They stood in the garden in the April afternoon, both of them slightly disheveled and entirely real. No performance between them, no version of themselves they were maintaining for the other's benefit. Yes, she said, just that. He had not expected it to land so hard, having been hoping for it for 6 months. Having told himself he was prepared for whatever she said. He was not prepared. His chest did something he hadn't authorized, and his throat tightened briefly, and he was not embarrassed by either of these things, which was its own small revelation. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "That's all you have to say?" "I have more," he said. "I just need a minute." She laughed. The real one. The unguarded one that happened before she could manage it. He reached out, and she came forward, and he held her in the garden with the turned soil under their feet, and the aspens coming green around them, and everything very imperfect and very right. They were married in June. Not a large wedding. Naomi had not wanted large, and he had not wanted large. And when two people who both want the same thing agree on it without discussion, it is one of the small, reliable signs that they understand each other. Ruth made food enough for 30 people, which was exactly how many came. Neighbors from 3 ranches, Clara's teacher, the family from the Miller property, who had been in the valley 40 years and attended every significant occasion as a matter of principle, and Silas, who stood at the edge of the gathering in his good suit and watched everything with the expression of a man who has done something he's satisfied with but isn't going to say so. Clara was the one who had insisted on flowers. She'd spent the previous 2 weekends with Ruth planning which ones and where, and the result was more flowers than the occasion strictly called for and exactly the right number for the occasion it actually was. She stood through the ceremony with the contained, particular pride of a child watching something she privately considers her own accomplishment come to fruition. The ceremony was short, a judge from the county seat, a few words, the exchange of plain rings that Gideon had ordered from the jeweler in Billings without making a production of it. When it was done, Naomi looked at her hand and then at him and said nothing, which was the right response for something that didn't need words. Afterward, Ruth found Gideon standing at the edge of the property, looking east toward the land that was his now, the east section with its lined cabin that had become, over a summer of work, something you could reasonably call a house. They'd moved into it in May, Naomi and Clara, and everything that came with them, the barnboard bookshelves and the books, the rag rug, the fox drawing, the flower boxes that froze every winter and got replanted every spring because Naomi had decided that was the correct relationship with flower boxes, and she wasn't changing it. "You look like a man who doesn't quite believe something," Ruth said. "I don't not believe it," he said. "I'm just not used to it yet." "You will be," she said. "How long did it take you and Silas?" She considered. "We still have mornings where I look at him across the kitchen table and think, 'Oh, you're still here,' like I have to reconfirm it." She paused. "I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's the opposite of taking it for granted." He looked at the house. Through the window, he could see Clara moving around inside, reorganizing something. She reorganized things compulsively when she was happy, he'd noticed, as if happiness required physical expression. Naomi was talking to one of the Miller women near the fence, her head tipped slightly the way it tipped when she was actually listening. "She's going to argue with me about the waterline placement," he said. "Almost certainly," Ruth said. "And the garden fence. She has opinions about the garden fence that I think are incorrect. You'll work it out." "We'll argue about it first." "Yes," Ruth said. "That's how working it out starts." He was quiet for a moment. "I found a letter I'd been meaning to send," he said. "To my sister in Colorado. I've been meaning to write back for 8 years. "Did you send it?" "Last week." He looked at the east horizon. "I told her I'd found somewhere to be. That she could write me at a permanent address." A pause. "She wrote back already. She's got 2 kids I've never met. A boy and a girl. She wants to come visit this fall." Ruth looked at him with that look she had. The one that wasn't maternal exactly, because Ruth was not a sentimental woman, but was the look of someone who has watched something unfold correctly and finds the correctness quietly satisfying. "Good," she said. "She's going to think I married up," he said. "You did?" Ruth said. "I know it," he said. Silas appeared at Ruth's elbow, as he often appeared, without announcement, having apparently teleported from wherever he'd been. He stood beside her and looked at the house, the land, Gideon. "Line cabin's holding up," he said. "Did the foundation right?" Gideon said. "Took the extra week to do it right." "It shows." Silas looked at the east fence line. His east fence, now Gideon's east fence, the line between them a border between 2 properties that were and would continue to be in permanent practical cooperation. "I'm going to need help with the fall rotation." "I figured," Gideon said. "You're not an employee anymore," Silas said. "Can't order you around." "You can ask," Gideon said. Silas looked at him. Then, with the economy of a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean, will you help me with the fall rotation? Yes, sir, Gideon said. Good, Silas said. And that was all. And it was enough. And all three of them knew it. Clara found him an hour later at the fence where Caleb was tied, being given more attention than he required by a child who considered him a personal friend. She'd changed out of her good dress into her regular clothes, which meant she'd made a unilateral decision about the formality level of the rest of the afternoon that no one had been consulted about. She was feeding Caleb something from her pocket, a piece of carrot, probably. She kept them there habitually, and talking to him in the low, continuous way she'd picked up from watching Gideon do it. He likes you, Gideon said. I know, Clara said. We have an understanding. He leaned on the fence beside her. The valley lay out in front of them in the June evening, the light going long and gold across the grass, the mountains to the north still carrying snow on the high peaks, the aspens along the creek dense and green. The valley he'd ridden into in September with a bedroll and a reference letter and no particular plan. Are you happy? Clara said. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without the social softening that most people applied to questions like that. He thought about it honestly, which was what she deserved. Yes, he said. I'm getting used to it, but yes. Is it weird? A little, he admitted. I've been moving around for a long time. Being somewhere permanently it's different from what I thought it would feel like. What did you think it would feel like? Like stopping, he said. Like an ending. What does it feel like instead? He looked at the valley, at the house with its lights coming on in the kitchen window, at the aspens and the creek and the mountains, at Clara beside him, feeding his horse carrots and waiting for an honest answer with the patience of someone who had learned that honest answers were worth waiting for. Like starting, he said. Clara considered this. Then she nodded, with the authority of someone filing a satisfactory answer, and turned back to Caleb, and the evening settled around them both with the long, easy light of a Montana June that didn't hurry toward dark, because there was no reason to hurry, and the light was good, and the valley had all the time in the world. A man who had been nobody's permanent fixture had become somebody's home. He hadn't done it by being extraordinary. He hadn't arrived with resources or reputation or a story that made him easy to trust. He'd done it the only way it actually works, one small, honest action at a time, in front of people who were paying attention, until the accumulation of those actions became something that could bear weight. That's not a romantic story. It's something better than that. It's a true one. Not the truth of events. None of this happened. These people don't exist. This valley has no name on any map. But the truth underneath the story, the kind that fiction carries when it's doing its job, that character is not what you announce. It's what you do when nobody asked you to, when there's no reward in it, when the creek bank is steep and dark, and the rain is horizontal, and the calf needs finding. It's the small things. It's always the small things. And the people who are patient enough to notice them are the people worth being seen by. Gideon Cross had spent 34 years being nobody's permanent fixture. He spent the rest of his life being exactly that. And the difference between those two versions of himself was not talent or luck or a grand moment of transformation. It was one afternoon on a trail when he got off his horse and said, "Let go of her arm," and meant it, and everything that followed from meaning it. The valley didn't remember him as the mysterious stranger from the North Road. After a few years, it didn't particularly remember that he'd been a stranger at all. He was just Gideon, the man on the east section, Naomi's husband, Clara's father, the one who did good fence work and showed up when things needed doing and didn't make a speech about either. Which is, if you think about it, exactly the kind of man a valley ought to remember.